In August of 2019, WeWork filed paperwork to go public on the New York Stock Exchange. This is a routine corporate event. Companies do it every day. You hire bankers, you prepare documents, you let the public look at your finances, and then institutional investors decide what your company is worth. The document you file is called an S-1. The document at its core, a disclosure. Here's what we do, here's how much money we make, here's how much money we lose, here are the risks. Sign here if you'd like to participate. The document's S-1 was 359 pages long. It used the word community 150 times. It documented the company's mission as elevating the world's consciousness. It included a letter from the CEO that opened with the line, "We are here to change the world, and we are just getting started." The document was that the CEO had personally trademarked the word "we," as in the pronoun, and had charged its own company $5.9 million to license it back from him. The document also disclosed that the company had lost $1.9 billion the previous year. The doctors and analysts read this document, and somewhere around page 30, a collective realization began spreading across Wall Street, roughly equivalent to the feeling you get when you're halfway through a movie and you realize you have no idea what's happening and you're not sure it matters. The document was pulled 6 weeks later. The CEO resigned. The company, which had been valued at $47 billion in January of that year, was suddenly worth somewhere between $9 and $12 billion. Within weeks, it was close to collapse. The document WeWork did not fail because of a bad product. It failed because for nearly a decade, everyone around Adam Neumann, his board, his investors, his banks, looked directly at what he was doing and decided it was genius. Here's what WeWork actually was. Underneath all of the language about consciousness, WeWork signed long-term leases on office buildings, 10, 15, 20 years. They renovated them into attractive, amenity-rich shared workspaces. Fast Wi-Fi, nice coffee, exposed brick, the aesthetic of a Brooklyn startup that had just raised a Series A. Then they subdivided those spaces and rented them out short-term to individuals and companies who didn't want to commit to traditional office leases. This is a real business model. It existed before WeWork. It is called serviced offices, or flexible workspace, and the company that pioneered it, IWG, formerly known as Regus, had been doing it since 1989 and was publicly traded on the London Stock Exchange. The fundamental risk of this model is not complicated. You have locked in long-term costs. Your revenue is short-term and cancelable. When the economy contracts, your tenants leave, but your landlords do not. You are, structurally, the most exposed company in any downturn. WeWork knew this. Their own S1 acknowledged it, but WeWork had a counterargument, and the counterargument was Adam Neumann. Adam Neumann was born in Israel. He moved to New York in his mid-20s and by his early 30s had become one of the most magnetically convincing people in American business. He was 6'5", charismatic in the way that makes people slightly uncomfortable about how much they want to agree with him. And he spoke about WeWork in terms that made the flexible office business sound like a movement. WeWork wasn't renting desks. WeWork was building community. WeWork wasn't a real estate company. WeWork was a technology company, a lifestyle company, a company that understood how human beings wanted to live and work in the 21st century. WeWork was, depending on which Neumann quote you pulled, either the world's first physical social network or the answer to global loneliness or the foundation of the first $1 trillion company. The investors heard this and did not say, "Sir, you sublease office space." They said, "Well, how much do you need?" Let's spend some time with Adam Neumann, because you can't understand the story without understanding how he operated. Neumann ran WeWork less like a CEO and more like the leader of a movement that happened to be a CFO. He walked through the offices barefoot. He gave speeches that blended business strategy with spiritual aspiration. He held company events that, by multiple accounts, felt more like revivals than all-hands meetings, complete with live music, alcohol, and the CEO telling employees that what they were doing mattered on a cosmic level. He was also, by the accounts of people who worked closely with him, exhausting and unpredictable in ways that made normal management nearly impossible. Decisions changed daily. Strategy pivoted constantly. and senior executives cycled through at a rate that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. WeWork's first CFO quit after a few months. Several others followed. There were always stories with Adam Neumann. He took a private jet to Israel with a group of employees. Someone bought marijuana. The marijuana was, allegedly, in a cereal box. The crew of the plane, upon discovering this after landing, threw the cereal box away. They didn't want the plane searched at customs. Neumann was reportedly displeased about that cereal box. He had a clause negotiated in his contract that if WeWork ever fired him without cause, they had to pay him enough money to buy back control of the company. If the board decided to get rid of him, they owed him enough money to let him take it back. He and his wife, Rebecca Neumann, started a private elementary school inside the company called WeGrow. WeGrow's philosophy, per its own promotional materials, included teaching children to use their energy and awareness to impact the world. Rebecca served as its chief education officer. She also held the title of chief brand officer of WeWork itself. The company at various points also launched WeLive, a co-living residential product, and explored something involving a yacht. The yacht was reportedly going to be called WeSail. It did not materialize, which is perhaps the only thing in this story that went according to plan. And this is all before we get to the governance. WeWork had a dual-class share structure that gave Neumann 20 votes per share to everyone else's 1. He had borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars against his WeWork shares, using the company's own inflated valuation as collateral. He had purchased office buildings and then leased them back to WeWork, meaning his company was paying rent to him personally. The S1 disclosed all of this. It was all in there, in the filing, in black and white, available to anyone who wanted to read it. People had been reading earlier versions of these disclosures in private funding rounds for years. They kept writing checks. This is where the story starts to get interesting, because Neumann alone doesn't explain WeWork. Neumann explains Neumann. What you need to explain is why serious, experienced, well-resourced people with financial responsibility to their own investors kept looking at Adam Neumann and deciding he was worth more money. The most important answer to that question is a man named Masayoshi Son. Masayoshi Son, Masa, as he's widely known, is the co-founder and CEO of SoftBank, the Japanese technology conglomerate. He had already been one of the most celebrated investors in the world before WeWork. His early bet on Alibaba had returned something like 2,500 times its value. The doc was, in the venture capital world, treated with the kind of deference you typically reserve for people who had been empirically correct about very large things. In late 2016, Son met with Adam Neumann. The meeting lasted roughly 12 minutes. Son toured the WeWork offices, got the pitch, and committed $4.4 billion. 12 minutes, $4.4 billion to Adam Neumann. Son later said he preferred crazy founders, no kidding, that conventional thinking produced conventional returns. Reportedly drew a sketch during the meeting that said WeWork's valuation should be 10 times higher than the current number. He was the market. SoftBank valued WeWork at $47 billion in January 2019. That number was not the result of careful financial modeling. It was the result of one very influential man deciding it felt right. So SoftBank eventually put in $10.65 billion across multiple rounds. They became WeWork's largest investor and, when the company nearly collapsed, its reluctant rescuer. But Son wasn't alone. JPMorgan Chase, one of the most sophisticated financial institutions on earth, was aggressively competing with Goldman Sachs for the right to lead WeWork's IPO. They had analysts, they had risk teams, they had access to WeWork's full financials, and they wanted to lead the IPO so badly that their CEO, Jamie Dimon, met with Neumann personally and, by most accounts, came away impressed. The WeWork board, for its part, had the power to check Neumann's behavior and largely didn't use it. The dual-class share structure that gave Neumann 20 votes per share was approved by the board. The $5.9 million We trademark purchase was approved by the board. The related party real estate transactions, where Newman's company paid rent to Newman personally, were flagged and approved. There's a term for what the board was doing. It's called failing to govern. When a board's job is oversight and the CEO's job is operations, and the CEO is buying his own company's trademark and leasing the company buildings he personally owns, and the board is saying yes to all of it, the board has stopped doing its job. The S1 was the moment the spell broke, and it broke fast. The problem wasn't any single disclosure. It was the cumulative picture, a company losing nearly $2 billion a year with no clear path to profitability, governed by a CEO with effectively unchecked power, whose personal financial interests were entangled with the company's in at least 3 distinct ways, and whose stated ambition was to live forever and become the world's first trillionaire. The last part was real. Newman had said both of these things in public on the record. Analysts and journalists tore through the S1 in real time. The coverage was not kind. One analyst called it the most bizarre, tone-deaf, and financially questionable IPO filing he had ever read. The Wall Street Journal, which had spent years writing mostly admiring profiles of the company, published a front-page investigation into Newman's conduct. Institutional investors who had been expected to anchor the IPO began making calls. Within weeks, the valuation estimates for the IPO had fallen from $47 billion to somewhere between $10 and $20 billion. Then the IPO was withdrawn entirely. On September 24, 2019, Adam Newman resigned as CEO of WeWork. His exit package, initially, was $1.7 billion. This included a consulting fee of $185 million for advice he would provide to the company he had just been asked to leave. That fee was later clawed back, but the fact that it was offered in the first place tells you something about the power dynamics that had existed inside WeWork for years. SoftBank stepped in with a bailout. They took effective control of the company, wrote down their investment by billions of dollars, and installed a turnaround CEO. WeWork eventually went public anyway, in 2021 via SPAC at a valuation of $9 billion. It continued losing money, and in November 2023, it filed for bankruptcy. The company that was going to elevate the world's consciousness could not pay its own landlords. So Adam Newman was 40 at the time of the IPO collapse. He left WeWork with hundreds of millions of dollars, despite having presided over one of the largest value destructions in startup history. He later started a new company, a residential real estate startup called Flow, and raised $350 million from Andreessen Horowitz. The venture capital industry, apparently, has a short memory. Then there's Rebecca Newman, who co-founded WeWork with her husband and held several senior roles. She was reportedly involved in interviewing and vetting senior executive candidates and had significant influence over company culture. After the collapse, she has largely stayed out of the public eye. Masayoshi Son publicly apologized to SoftBank shareholders for the WeWork investment. His vision fund, a $100 billion vehicle that had also backed Uber, Slack, and dozens of other high-profile companies, reported losses of tens of billions of dollars in the years following. The WeWork board, including representatives from SoftBank and Benchmark Capital, among others, no board member faced meaningful personal or professional consequences for the governance failures that had accumulated over the years. And then there's the employees, tens of thousands of them at WeWork's peak. And they were the people who bore the most disproportionate costs. Thousands were laid off during the restructuring. Many held stock options that became utterly worthless, and they had believed genuinely in what they were building. The document's down really quick. So this was a decade-long failure of governance and investor due diligence that burned through billions of dollars of capital and destroyed thousands of jobs and produced approximately zero accountability for any of the people who were most responsible. So what were some of these key failures here? So the first one was that the board allowed a governance structure that made accountabilities structurally impossible. 20-to-1 voting rights combined with a CEO removal clause that required paying Newman enough to buy back the company meant that the board had no real mechanism for correction. They gave that up voluntarily over years in exchange for continued access to a charismatic founder. You cannot outsource governance to the personality of a CEO. 2. SoftBank's investment logic was based on a theory of the founder, not a theory of the business. Masayoshi wasn't wrong that bold bets on unconventional founders can produce enormous returns. He was wrong that this principle is infinitely scalable and applies regardless of what the underlying business actually does. WeWork was a real estate company. Real estate companies have real estate math, and math never worked. 3. The banks failed their own clients. JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs were not investing their own money. They were selling the IPO to pension funds, endowments, and retail investors. The fee incentive to get the deal done was in direct conflict with the obligation to price it honestly. When you read that two of the most sophisticated banks in the world were competing for the privilege of taking WeWork public at $47 billion, you should understand that competing in that sentence means competing for the fee, not competing to provide the most accurate valuation. 4. The WeWork story was widely covered and largely celebrated for years before the IPO. Journalists, analysts, and business school professors wrote admiringly about Newman and his vision. The warning signs were present. The governance structure was not secret. The losses were not secret. But the narrative was so compelling that scrutiny was slow to arrive. The $47 billion valuation was not arrived at in secret. It happened in public, with sophisticated people watching. So, WeWork is a story about the gravitational pull of a good story. The company had a product that worked, a founder who could sell, and a venture capital environment that had been rewarding exactly this kind of thinking. Every person in the chain, those investors, board members, and banks, had a short-term incentive to believe, and the long-term cost was paid by employees and later investors, and then the broader market in the form of a cautionary tale that seems to require relearning every decade or so. So, WeWork is a more absurd story than last episodes, but the management lessons are just as applicable, and most of them don't require you to be running a billion-dollar company to put into practice. So lesson 1, know the difference between a metric and a story. So WeWork's $47 billion valuation was not a measurement. It was a narrative that one very influential investor chose to believe, and that everyone else accepted because disagreeing with Masayoshi felt risky. The number became self-reinforcing. Banks cited it, journalists reported it, employees made career decisions based on it, and almost nobody stopped to ask whether it was grounded in anything real. This happens at every scale. A department gets a reputation for high performance based on metrics that don't actually measure performance. A project is described as on track because the status report says green, not because anyone looked closely. A vendor is considered reliable because they've always delivered, till the one time they don't, and it turns out nobody had checked in months. As a manager, your job is to distinguish between the story being told about a situation and the underlying reality. This means occasionally going around the summary and looking at the raw data. It means asking the person 2 levels down what they actually think, not just reading the deck their manager prepared. The story and the reality can diverge for a long time before anything breaks, and then they correct all at once. Lesson 2. Accountability needs a mechanism, not just a value. So WeWork's board believed in accountability. They just didn't build any structures that enforced it. They approved a voting arrangement that made Newman impossible to remove. They signed off on conflicts of interest because the founder was compelling and the growth numbers looked good. When things started going wrong, they had no tools left. For all sorts of managers, this is the most transferable lesson in the episode. Accountability isn't a culture statement on the wall. It's a set of specific operational structures. Who reviews what, and what schedule, with what authority to act. Performance reviews that have real consequences, approval chains that require sign-off from more than one person on significant decisions, and then there's escalation paths that are tested before they're needed. If the only mechanism for holding someone accountable is a conversation that hasn't happened yet, you don't have accountability. You have the intention of accountability. Those are very different things, and they produce very different outcomes when the pressure is on. Lesson 3. Charisma is a management risk, not just an asset. Newman was genuinely compelling. That's not in dispute. The problem is that his charisma functioned as a replacement for scrutiny rather than a complement to it. People who should have asked hard questions didn't, because being in the room with him felt like being in the presence of something real. Every organization has someone like this at some scale. The sales leader whose numbers are never questioned, the executive whose projects always get approved, the manager whose team would follow them anywhere. Charisma is useful, but it needs to be balanced by a culture where the work is evaluated independently of the person. As a manager, the practical version of this is when you find yourself approving something primarily because of who proposed it rather than what was proposed, stop. Ask what you'd think of the proposal if someone you didn't particularly like had brought it to you. That's the actual quality of the idea. So evaluate that. Lesson 4. When someone's incentives don't align with the organization's, say it out loud. Newman was borrowing against his shares, buying buildings and leasing them back to WeWork, and holding the trademark to the company's own name. Each of these created a situation where that was good for Adam Newman was not necessarily what was good for WeWork. The board knew that, and they approved it anyways, without ever making the conflict explicit or putting structures in place to manage it. This dynamic is everywhere in ordinary places. In ordinary workplaces, a manager whose team's headcount determines their own bonus has an incentive to grow their team regardless of whether the organization needs it or not. And a project lead whose reputation is tied to a project's success has an incentive to downplay problems. A salesperson on pure commission has an incentive to close deals that aren't right for the customers. None of these people are villains. They're responding to the incentive structures that have been built. The job of good management is to name these conflicts openly and either restructure the incentives or put explicit checks in place. Pretending the conflicts don't exist doesn't make them go away, it just means they operate without anyone watching. The WeWork story has been told in a lot of formats. There's a book, a Hulu docuseries, a podcast, an Apple TV Plus drama with Jared Leto playing Adam Newman. If you want the fullest account, Elliot Brown and Maureen Farrell's book, The Cult of We, is the definitive version. Deeply reported, occasionally jaw-dropping. But I'd also recommend looking up the original S1, not all 359 pages, just the first 30 or so, the CEO letter, the mission statement, the section on governance. It is a document that tells you everything you need to know about the difference between a company and the performance of a company. The tell was always in the text. Adam Newman, as of this recording, is running his new company, collecting his venture capital funding, and giving interviews in which he describes the lessons he's learned. Thank you for listening to Mismanaged. I'm Joseph, and I'll see you in the next one.